Rain whispered against the windows the first night I noticed the doll was staring at me. It sat on the narrow shelf opposite my bed, porcelain skin pale as candle wax, its painted smile frozen in a way that felt less friendly the longer I watched. I told myself it was nothing, just an old toy left behind when I rented the house, another relic among the creaking floors and drafty halls. Still, when I turned off the light, I could feel its gaze pressing into the dark. Rain whispered against the windows the first night I noticed the doll was staring at me, but it wasn't the sound that kept me awake, it was the certainty that something in the room was aware of me in a way objects should not be. The doll sat on the narrow shelf opposite my bed, legs dangling stiffly over the edge, porcelain skin pale as candle wax. Its painted smile was small and neat, the kind meant to be comforting, yet the longer I watched it, the more that smile felt like a decision rather than a feature. I told myself it was nothing, just an old toy left behind when I rented the house, another forgotten relic among the creaking floors and drafty halls. Houses like this always had leftovers from other lives. But when I turned off the light, the darkness didn't erase the feeling. If anything, it sharpened it. I could feel its gaze pressing into the dark, steady and patient. At first, I blamed my nerves. New house, unfamiliar sounds, the imagination filling in gaps where certainty should have been. I rolled onto my side, facing the wall, and counted my breaths until sleep finally dragged me under. When I woke later, how much later, I couldn't tell, the room felt subtly wrong. Not changed in any obvious way, just tilted, like a picture frame hung slightly off-center. My eyes drifted, unthinking, back to the shelf. The doll was still there. Of course it was. Yet something about it made my stomach tighten. The eyes, I realized. They were glassy, dark, and reflective, catching just enough moonlight to gleam. I could have sworn they were angled differently now, no longer staring past me, but directly at my face. I sat up, heart thudding, and leaned forward until my feet touched the cold floor. The house sighed around me, pipes ticking, wood settling. I told myself to look carefully, to prove my fear wrong. Porcelain eyes were fixed in place, weren't they? Painted or set, but immovable. I studied the doll for a long moment, noting every detail, the faint crack near its left temple, the frayed lace on its dress, the way its hands rested palms down on its lap. When I was satisfied nothing had changed, I laughed softly at myself. Sleep tricks the mind. Shadows lie. I lay back down and forced my eyes shut. The next morning, daylight made the room feel ordinary again. Dust motes floated lazily in the air. The doll looked harmless, even pathetic, like something that should have been donated years ago. I went about my day, unpacking boxes, exploring the rest of the house, learning which floorboards complained the loudest. Still, the image of those eyes followed me, a faint afterimage behind my thoughts. That night, I left the lamp on. I told myself it was temporary, just until I settled in. As I drifted toward sleep, my gaze slid, unbidden, back to the shelf. The doll's eyes reflected the light differently now, catching it at a sharper angle. They seemed more alert, less dull, as if they had adjusted to the room. I tested it then, a childish impulse I immediately regretted. I rolled onto my side, facing away, and counted to 10. Slowly, deliberately, I turned back. The doll was the same. I exhaled. I turned away again, counted to 10, and looked back once more. This time, my breath caught. The change was subtle, so subtle I almost convinced myself it wasn't real, but the eyes were no longer centered. They were angled just enough that I could tell, with a sickening certainty, that they were aligned with me. Not the bed. Me. My heart began to race, logic scrambling to keep up. Maybe the shelf wasn't level. Maybe the light played tricks on curved glass. I stood, crossed the room, and lifted the doll into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, cool and smooth against my skin. Up close, the eyes looked ordinary again, vacant and lifeless. I turned the doll slightly, tilting its head, then set it back exactly where it had been. I even marked the shelf with a tiny pencil line so I'd know if it moved. When I returned to bed, I told myself the test was over. There was nothing left to prove. Sleep came in fragments. Each time I woke, the same sensation washed over me, that quiet pressure of being watched. I refused to look again. I stared at the ceiling, at the faint water stain shaped like a cloud, and listened to the rain. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion won. When morning light crept in, pale and weak, I finally turned my head. The pencil mark was untouched. The doll hadn't moved. Yet the eyes were wrong again, unmistakably wrong, no longer merely aligned with my bed, but raised slightly, as if they had been watching my face while I slept, memorizing the shape of my expressions, learning the exact moment my eyes would open, and in that instant I understood that the doll didn't need to move its body to change position, it only needed me to notice, because every time my attention returned to it, the space between us felt smaller, the stare more precise, as though something invisible was leaning forward from inside the porcelain, adjusting its focus, waiting for the moment I would look away again. The sounds began quietly enough that I could almost pretend they weren't happening. A faint noise, barely louder than the house settling, would slip into my dreams and pull me back to the surface of sleep. At first, I thought it was the rain tapping against the gutters or branches brushing the siding, but this sound was closer, sharper, like two hard surfaces touching and separating again. A soft click. Plastic or porcelain, I couldn't tell. Each time it happened, my eyes snapped open, my heart already racing as if some deeper part of me had been awake long before my mind caught up. I lay still, listening. The room was dim, washed in silver moonlight, every familiar shape stretched into something uncertain. The doll sat on the shelf, exactly where I'd left it, its dress casting a thin, crooked shadow against the wall. I waited for the sound to repeat, holding my breath, counting the seconds between my heartbeats. Nothing. Just the low hum of the house and the distant whisper of rain. When I finally let myself relax, the sound came again. Click. This time, closer, deliberate, like the careful testing of a joint. I told myself it was the shelf expanding in the cold, or the old wood reacting to moisture. Houses made noises. Old houses made lots of them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound had intention, that it occurred only when I was awake enough to hear it. I turned my head slowly toward the shelf. The doll hadn't moved. Its eyes caught the moonlight, dull and dark, offering nothing back. I waited, staring, daring it to prove me wrong. Minutes passed. My eyelids grew heavy. Just as I began to drift again, I heard it, another click, followed by something new. A faint, shallow sound, almost like breath. I sat up so fast the room spun. The sound stopped immediately, swallowed by silence. My chest burned as I sucked in air, trying to steady myself. Breathing. That was ridiculous. Dolls didn't breathe. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, every nerve screaming at me to turn on the light, but I didn't. I was afraid of what the sudden brightness might reveal, afraid that seeing too much would be worse than seeing nothing at all. Instead, I took one cautious step toward the shelf. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, thick against my skin. I leaned in, close enough to see the fine cracks in the porcelain, the tiny imperfections in the paint. I listened. Nothing. No breath, no clicking, no movement. The doll was inert, lifeless, exactly as it should be. I laughed under my breath, the sound brittle and unconvincing, and stepped back. As soon as my heel touched the floor, the sound returned behind me. Click! This time, it was unmistakably from the shelf. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, every muscle locked, as the sound repeated, slow and measured, like fingers tapping together in thought. Then came the breath again, faint but close, too close. It wasn't the deep rise and fall of lungs drawing air, it was shallow, controlled, as if whatever made the sound didn't need to breathe but did it anyway, out of habit or curiosity. My skin prickled, a cold sweat breaking across my back. I took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate, careful not to provoke whatever was behind me. When I finally reached the door, I yanked it open and flooded the room with hallway light. The sounds vanished instantly, as if they'd never existed. I spun around, scanning the shelf, the floor, the corners of the room. The doll sat exactly where it always had, its expression unchanged, its eyes dull and empty. I stayed there for a long time, light blazing, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won. I slept on the couch that night, every light in the house turned on. The next morning, the room felt normal again, almost mocking in its calm. I checked the shelf first thing. No dust disturbed, no sign of movement. The doll was silent, inert. I tried to convince myself that the sounds were nothing more than my nerves unraveling, that once fear took root, it found patterns everywhere. That night, though, the sounds returned, louder now, more confident. Click! Click! A soft scrape, like porcelain shifting against wood. I stayed perfectly still, eyes locked on the shelf. The doll didn't move. Not a fraction of an inch. Yet the sounds continued, circling the room, rising and falling as if something invisible was adjusting itself, learning how to exist in the space between moments, breathing not because it had to, but because it wanted me to hear it, because it wanted me awake, listening, imagining the impossible while the doll remained perfectly still by morning, its silence heavier than any noise, its unblinking eyes reflecting the truth I was no longer able to deny, that whatever made those sounds did not need to move when watched, only when believed, and every night I listened, the belief settled deeper, filling the room, filling me, until the darkness itself seemed to inhale and hold its breath, waiting for me to do the same. I didn't go looking for the photographs at first. The house itself pushed me toward them, the way it seemed to narrow my choices until curiosity felt less like a decision and more like a necessity. After another sleepless night, I began opening drawers and cabinets I'd ignored before, searching for anything that might explain the sounds, the watching, the growing sense that the doll was no longer just an object but a presence with history. In the back of a hallway closet, behind a stack of yellowed newspapers and a broken lamp, I found a shallow cardboard box tied shut with twine. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, loose and unorganized, their edges soft with age. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something sweeter beneath it, like old perfume. I sat on the floor and began sorting through them, telling myself I was only killing time, that this was harmless. Most were ordinary, families posed stiffly on porches, children squinting in bright sunlight, holiday gatherings frozen in forced smiles. Then I saw it. In the corner of one photo, half obscured by shadow, sat the doll. It was unmistakable. The same porcelain face, the same painted smile, the same dark, glassy eyes. The dress was different, older, but the body beneath it was identical. I told myself it had to be coincidence. Dolls were mass-produced. Styles repeated. Still, my hands trembled as I pulled the photo closer. The doll sat on a shelf behind a young woman, her expression tired, her eyes ringed with dark circles. She wasn't smiling. None of them were. I flipped the photo over. No date. No names. As I dug deeper into the box, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Photo after photo revealed the same doll, always somewhere in the background. On a mantel behind a newlywed couple. On a bedside table beside a man staring blankly at the camera. On a windowsill in a child's room, the child's face blurred slightly, as if they had moved just as the shutter clicked. The doll never appeared twice with the same people, never in the same arrangement of rooms, yet it was always there, watching from the edges, its eyes angled toward the lens. My pulse hammered in my ears as I noticed something else. The people in the photographs grew fewer as time went on. Early pictures showed groups, families, gatherings, rooms full of life. Later ones held only one person, sitting or standing alone, their posture tense, their eyes unfocused. In the final photograph at the bottom of the box, there was no person at all. Just an empty room, sparsely furnished, and the doll centered perfectly in the frame, facing forward as if posing for a portrait of its own. I checked the dates then, faintly penciled on the backs of a few photos. They spanned decades. 30, 40 years at least. The clothing changed. The furniture styles shifted. The doll did not. It remained untouched by time, uncracked, unclouded, its gaze as sharp in the oldest photo as it was in the most recent. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach as I realized the house wasn't the common thread. The people weren't either. The doll was. I began searching the rest of the house with new urgency, opening drawers, rifling through old files left behind by previous tenants. In a desk drawer, I found folded letters, unsent, their ink faded. The handwriting varied, but the tone did not. Each letter spoke of feeling watched, of sleepless nights, of a presence that grew stronger the more attention it received. One letter ended abruptly, the final line trailing off mid-sentence, the pen digging so hard into the paper it tore through. In the attic, tucked beneath insulation, I found a small album bound in cracked leather. Inside were more photographs, these carefully arranged. Someone had taken the time to catalogue them, to preserve the evidence. Notes were scribbled in the margins, dates, addresses, brief observations. Moved the doll to the basement, returned by morning. Avoided looking at it, worse at night. Gave it away, new owner gone within 6 months. My throat tightened as I realized what I was holding. This wasn't a collection. It was a record. One photo stopped me cold. The room looked familiar. Too familiar. My bedroom. The angle was slightly different, but the shelf was unmistakable. And there, sitting exactly where it sat now, was the doll. The photograph was dated years before I'd ever set foot in the house. My reflection stared back at me from the glossy surface of the image, pale and distorted, my face hovering over the doll as I held the photo too close, and in that reflection, the doll's eyes seemed brighter, more alive, as if recognizing me. I dropped the album, my hands numb. The realization crept in slowly, insidiously. The people in the photographs hadn't just lived with the doll. They had noticed it. They had watched it watching them. And one by one, they had disappeared from the record, leaving behind only images and words, traces of attention that never truly faded. The doll wasn't bound to the house or to time. It moved through owners, through spaces, carried forward by curiosity and disbelief, appearing wherever someone chose to keep it, to observe it, to question it. That night, I couldn't bring myself to return the photographs to their hiding places. I stacked them on the table, spreading them out, trying to map the connections, to understand the order of events. As the hours passed, the room felt smaller, the walls inching closer. I became acutely aware of where the doll was, even without looking, as if a thread stretched between us, tightening with every thought I gave it, every image burned into my mind. When I finally glanced toward the shelf, my breath caught. The doll was facing the table now, its eyes angled downward, not toward the bed, not toward the door, but toward the photographs themselves, as if studying its own history, as if confirming that I had finally seen what all the others had seen before they vanished, as if recognition was the final step, the moment when the past and present aligned, and the watching became complete. I decided the doll had to go the same night I saw it watching the photographs. The decision felt sudden, sharp, like a reflex, but it had been forming for days beneath my fear. I wrapped the doll in an old towel, careful not to look at its face, and placed it inside a cardboard box. The moment the lid closed, the air in the room seemed to loosen, as if something tight in my chest had finally given way. I didn't allow myself to hesitate. Hesitation felt dangerous. Attention felt worse. I drove until the house was a shrinking shadow in my rearview mirror, the box heavy on the passenger seat despite its size. Every red light felt like a test of my resolve, every reflective surface an invitation to look. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands clenched around the steering wheel. At the edge of town, I stopped near a row of industrial dumpsters behind a closed grocery store. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels staged. I carried the box out, dropped it into the metal container, and slammed the lid shut with more force than necessary. The sound echoed, final and satisfying. I slept better than I had in weeks. No clicking. No breath. No pressure of being watched. Morning light filled the house with a sense of normalcy I'd almost forgotten. I told myself it was over, that objects only held power as long as we gave it to them. I even laughed once, out loud, at how quickly relief had replaced terror. That afternoon, I returned home from the store, arms full of groceries, already planning to throw out the photographs next. When I stepped into the bedroom, the box slipped from my hands and clattered across the floor. The doll sat on the shelf. Not placed carefully. Not arranged. It sat crooked, legs dangling unevenly, as if set there in a hurry. The towel lay folded beneath it, the same one I had wrapped it in, clean and dry. My mouth went dry. I backed out of the room slowly, my pulse roaring in my ears. Logic scrambled for explanations, someone playing a prank, a mistake, exhaustion twisting my memory, but none of them could explain the way the doll's eyes were fixed on the doorway, waiting. I didn't touch it this time. I grabbed my keys and left again, driving farther, faster. I dumped the doll at a gas station miles away, slipping the box behind an overflowing trash bin beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. I watched from my car until an employee came out and tossed another bag on top of it. Only then did I leave. That night, I stayed with a friend. I didn't tell them why. I didn't sleep much, but the fear felt distant, manageable. When I returned home the next morning, the doll was back. Not on the shelf. On the bed, propped against the pillows, its porcelain hands resting neatly in its lap. The sheets beneath it were unwrinkled, undisturbed, as if it had always belonged there. I felt something inside me fracture, a thin line between fear and understanding finally snapping. I grabbed the doll and threw it into the trunk of my car, slamming it shut and locking it twice. I drove straight to the edge of town and kept going, the road unspooling endlessly ahead of me. I left the doll at a donation center, slipping it onto a shelf between cracked toys and stuffed animals with missing eyes. I didn't look back. I drove home with my jaw clenched, repeating a single thought over and over, it's not mine anymore. That night, exhaustion dragged me into sleep like a tide. I dreamed of empty rooms and shelves lined with eyes. I woke to the sound of fabric brushing fabric. Soft. Careful. I didn't open my eyes at first. I knew better. The air felt heavy again, thick with awareness. Slowly, against every instinct I had left, I turned my head. The doll stood beside the bed, closer than ever before, its face level with mine. The shelf across the room was empty. The distance between us was gone. I realized then that each attempt to get rid of it hadn't driven it away, it had only shortened the path back to me. From that night on, the doll no longer returned to the shelf. It appeared in doorways, on chairs, at the foot of the bed. Each time, it was closer than before. Each time, I noticed it sooner. I tried covering it, locking it away, refusing to acknowledge it, but the more I avoided it, the more intrusive its presence became, as if denial itself drew it forward. I began to understand the notes in the album, the escalating desperation, the pattern of failure. The doll did not need to be owned to stay. It only needed to be recognized. One evening, as I stood in the hallway, heart pounding, I realized I could no longer remember the exact moment it had first arrived in the house. The memory had blurred, softened, as if it had never truly been an intrusion at all. The doll stood at the threshold of my bedroom, its eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I felt not fear, but a cold, sinking clarity, that it wasn't returning to me anymore. It was arriving, step by step, closer each time, not moving through space, but through my attempts to escape it, through every decision that gave it form, until there was no distance left to cross, and the stair no longer traveled across the room but existed inches from my own thoughts, patient, inevitable, waiting. For the moment I would understand that throwing it away had never been the test, and that bringing it back had never been the choice. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, threading itself through my thoughts until it was impossible to separate from them. I had stopped trying to get rid of the doll. Not because I accepted it, but because every attempt had only tightened its presence around me, like a knot pulled harder each time I struggled. Instead, I tried something else. I tried not to look at it. I moved through the house with my eyes fixed on the floor, memorizing the pattern of cracks in the wood, the stains on the walls, anything to avoid meeting that stare. For a while, it seemed to work. The doll stayed where it was, silent, still, as if waiting. That was when I noticed something worse. Even when I didn't see it, I could feel when it was being noticed. Not by me, but by the house itself, by the spaces I moved through. The air changed when my thoughts drifted toward it. My chest tightened the instant curiosity crept in, the moment my mind wondered where it was now. And every time that thought surfaced, no matter how brief, the distance between us shrank. I would turn a corner and find it closer than before, not because it had walked there, but because my attention had summoned it. I tested the idea carefully, afraid of proving it true. One afternoon, I sat in the living room and forced myself to think about anything else. I counted breaths, replayed old conversations, recited grocery lists in my head. Hours passed. When I finally stood and looked down the hallway, the doll remained at the far end, barely visible in shadow. Relief washed over me, thin and fragile. Then, against my better judgment, I focused on it. Just for a second. I wondered what it wanted. I wondered how it worked. I wondered if it knew what it was doing. When I looked again, it stood halfway down the hall. My hand shook as understanding took shape. The doll wasn't bound by shelves or rooms or physical effort. It didn't need joints to bend or feet to step forward. It moved through something far simpler and far more dangerous. Awareness. The act of being perceived gave it position. Attention gave it proximity. Every glance, every fearful thought, every attempt to understand it pulled it closer, anchoring it more firmly in my reality. I remembered the photographs then, the way the doll always lingered at the edges of the frame, never demanding focus, never centered until the people were gone. It had waited for them to look first, to question, to notice. I remembered the letters, the notes about avoiding it, about trying not to see. They hadn't failed because they looked too much. They failed because they couldn't stop thinking about it. Neither could I. The nights grew longer. Sleep became a careful exercise in mental discipline. I learned to lie perfectly still, my gaze fixed on a blank stretch of wall, my thoughts scattered deliberately. If my mind drifted, even slightly, the pressure returned, that sense of something leaning closer. Sometimes I would wake with my heart pounding, certain I had thought of it in my sleep. In those moments, I could feel it near, the air heavier, the silence fuller, as if the darkness itself was occupied. It was on one of those nights, exhausted and trembling, that the final understanding settled in. I had been thinking of the doll as something separate, something invading my space. But that wasn't accurate anymore. The boundary had eroded too much. The doll existed where my attention rested. When I thought of it, it was there. When I feared it, it advanced. When I tried to fight it, it solidified. It wasn't traveling toward me. It was forming itself out of my awareness, step by step, thought by thought. I began to notice gaps in my memory. Moments where I couldn't recall whether I had seen the doll or only imagined it. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. Sometimes, I would catch myself staring in its direction without realizing when I'd turned my head. Other times, I would feel watched and realize the sensation was coming from inside me, not from across the room. The stare no longer needed eyes. It had learned my patterns, my fears, the way my mind circled back to it no matter how hard I tried to flee. I thought of the last photograph in the box, the empty room with only the doll centered in the frame. It hadn't been taken after the people disappeared. It had been taken after they were no longer needed. After their attention had been fully consumed. The doll didn't take bodies. It took focus. It hollowed space out by occupying the awareness that once belonged to someone else, until there was nothing left to notice but it. Standing alone in the house one evening, I realized I could no longer tell whether the doll was in front of me or whether I was inside its gaze. The fear had changed shape, becoming quieter, more intimate. I wasn't being hunted. I was being absorbed. Every attempt to define it, to understand its limits, only gave it more structure. The only moments of distance came when my thoughts fractured completely, when exhaustion blurred my mind into something unfocused and useless to it. And that was when the true horror settled in, heavy and inescapable, because I understood that attention was not something I could simply turn off, that curiosity and fear were reflexes as much as choices, and that as long as I was aware of the doll, as long as it existed in my mind as a question, it would continue to exist everywhere else, closer each time, not as a figure crossing the room, but as a presence occupying the space behind my eyes, staring outward through my own thoughts, waiting for me to look back.